Maybe for those of you who don't know me, I'm John Fazio, and I'm with the Northwest Power and Conservation Council. I've been with them for quite a while. I work in the power division, and my specialty is working on computer models that simulate the operation of the power system, specifically to assess adequacy. And so today I'm going to be focusing on the Council's resource adequacy standard and our power supply planning and how they work together. I should mention, since Fred brought it up earlier, that there really is a substantive difference between what I would call short-term and long-term adequacy. They are obviously related, but what happened in California and what's happening potentially in or could happen in the Northwest and is as I would describe it, short-term adequacy is managing existing resources and managing the sharing of information and sharing of resources across balancing authorities to try to maintain your operating reserve requirements so that you have a stable system and you don't cut anybody off. The adequacy that we are associated with at the Council is more long-term adequacy, which is determining sort of what types of resources to acquire to ensure that future power supplies will also provide an adequate system. And so while they're very related, the work that we do is I would say substantively different from what the Northwest Power Pool is trying to do and sort of what the California ISO is doing in terms of maintaining these short-term, like real-time or short-time requirements to maintain certain reserve requirements. So if questions come up about the short-term adequacy, I have limited knowledge, but I'll try to do the best I can. The focus for today is how does the Council plan for future resources to ensure that those power supplies will be adequate? And so I'm going to begin with, and please let me know if you don't hear me, if I lose the connection or if you don't see my screen. And again, ask questions as we go along if by either, I guess just speaking up, because I don't see a raised hand in Zoom here. Is that the only way to get a hold of me, Fred?
Yeah, I think there's a way to do it, but it's clumsy. And so I would just say we could have post questions in the chat if you can see the chat, or just get on voice and ask questions when you're ready.
Let me turn the chat on. Where is that? Let's see.
Should be down below.
Well, I'm not seeing much here because I've got the screen. Oh, wait up here.
We're not muted out here in TV land.
Oh, in that case, then why don't you just speak up? That's the easiest way. How about that?
I think that's right.
Except for Jim Lazar. He has to send a text. Just kidding. So my wife is on two virtual choirs, and they use Zoom, but they have to mute everybody because otherwise everybody is totally out of sync, and it sounds horrible. So what they do is they have one person, the main person, singing and playing the music, and then they practice, and then at the end they record themselves and somebody syncs it all together. It's an amazing process. Okay, so what are we doing today? I'm going to first talk about a little bit about resource adequacy and what the Council's adequacy standard is, what the status of the Pacific Northwest Power Supply is in terms of adequacy, and a little bit about what the effects of climate change have on adequacy. And then the major part of the presentation today is how we incorporate adequacy into our resource planning. And I'm going to talk about two parameters that are actually very similar to other parameters that utilities use, but we changed the names to protect the innocent. No, we changed the names because they're slightly differently defined. And they are the adequacy reserve margin, which is very similar to the planning reserve margin, and the associated system capacity contribution, which is very similar to ELCC, or the effective load carrying capability, or the effective load capacity. I don't know exactly what it stands for, something like that. So anyway, and I will explain the differences and why we are doing it differently. So let's begin with reliability versus adequacy. My background is in physics, not that that makes any difference, but I do want to make sure that we are very precise when we speak of things, even in IEEE meetings. I'm a member of an IEEE committee and the NERC committee, And we insist that it's very important to make sure that you are very accurate and precise when you define something. And there's a lot of people out there who interchange reliability and adequacy, and they are two absolutely different things. So according to NERC, and I don't agree with their definition, but I'll explain how. According to NERC, adequacy and reliability are two different things. A power system is reliable if it is both adequate and secure. And the definition of adequate, according to NERC, is that the electric system can supply. It's adequate if it can supply the aggregate electrical demand and energy requirements of the customers at all times, taking into account scheduled and reasonably expected unscheduled outages of system elements. And secure pertains pretty much to the delivery of that energy, or essentially the transmission system. So that's how some people interpret it. Now, I have a little bit of a problem with this, and I've voiced this to NERC. Obviously, they haven't changed it. But I think at all times is a real problem, because nobody plans for a 100% adequate system, because it would be way too expensive. So I would change that if I could. Instead of saying at all times, I would say most of the time, depending on the customer's tolerance for curtailment. But it's a minor point. The point is that we're going to be talking about adequacy, essentially having sufficient supply so that you can serve all of your load, transmission notwithstanding. Of course, we assume that there's for these calculations, we assume that the transmission is there and that it never has any problems. So that is one of the limitations of what we do. Although a lot of utilities around the Northwest and around the world now are trying to combine the two and have sort of a composite assessment of adequacy, where they take into account not only generation, but also the bulk transmission system. And nobody, as far as I know, is also including distribution in that, because it's just computationally way too difficult to do. So, and please, again, stop me if you have questions. So the main idea here is that here we have a chart that has cost on the vertical scale and the level of adequacy. Horizontal scale, I'm sure you've seen some version of this. The blue line, the red line that's going up is your investment in capital, resources, et cetera. As you add more resources, of course, the adequacy becomes higher, but the cost goes up. If you don't build resources, then the cost of curtailment goes up. So if you have low investments in resources, that generally results in higher curtailment costs. The more you invest in resources, the lower the curtailment cost, but of course, the higher your average system cost. And theoretically, at least, what you want to do is you want to come up with some optimum mix that yields a minimum cost. This, a lot of regions in the world are experimenting with including the value of lost load in setting up their adequacy standards, so that they can take this sort of thing into account. The problem is that the value of lost load is very sensitive to the customers who you're dealing with. One example is the National Grid in the UK is assuming approximately a $33,000 per megawatt hour value of lost load, and they've used that to set up their long-term planning adequacy standard of no more than 3 hours per year loss of load hours, just as one example. Anyway. Okay, what is an adequacy standard? Well, an adequacy standard is composed of two parts, a metric, something that you can measure, and a threshold or some kind of a limit for that metric. There are generally two methods of assessing adequacy. There's the deterministic metric, which has been around for a long time. It's basically like just calculating the balance between your loads and resources. Bonneville Power and the Pacific Northwest Utility Commission Conference, is that what their name, PNUCC, have been producing these reports every year where they essentially, like a CPA, they list the resources on one side and the loads on the other, and they say, here's the balance, and there we are. It's not a very good measure of adequacy. Most people now, most utilities in the world are moving toward probabilistic metrics, where they measure some form of frequency, duration, and magnitude of potential curtailment or shortfall events. However, nobody is actually quite there yet. While the industry is moving toward probabilistic metrics, the only sort of consistent or most commonly used measure is, I'm sure you've heard of this, is the 1 in 10 year LOLE, loss of load expectations. But in the IEEE committee that I chaired a couple years ago, I'm still a member of, the Resource Adequacy Working Group. We are probably going to write a paper to emphasize that that the interpretation of a 1 day in 10-year loss of load expectations into 24 hours per 10 years or 2.4 hours per year is not the most appropriate way, not the most or the best interpretation of that measure. And so NERC is moving away from that. NERC is actually, and I'm on a committee for NERC too that helps set this up. NERC's preferred measures of adequacy are expected unserved energy, which is a measure of magnitude, loss of load hours, which is a measure of duration, and they're moving toward LOLEV, which is loss of load events, which measure the number of potential events over a 1 year or 10-year period. And so while they have standardized the definition of all of these metrics, they in no way are going to try to set a standard. In other words, they will define the metric, but they are not mandated to set a threshold. And that's mostly because the systems are so different across the country that for an adequate system in the Southeast and an adequate system in the Northwest, we may have, even though we might be using the same metrics, we may have vastly different thresholds because of the types of resources that we have in our systems. So the council, what does the council do? Well, the council uses a probabilistic method to assess adequacy and to set their standard. We use a Monte Carlo chronological hourly simulation model. It's called the Genesis model, stands for the Generation Evaluation System. It was built in 1999. I can give you some of the history of that if it's interesting. But we run thousands of simulations for a particular future operating year, and every time, and it's an hourly simulation, and every time we run the operation of that year, we pick different combinations of future uncertainties, and those uncertainties are natural river flows, temperatures, and loads, obviously, generator forced outages, and different wind and solar generation patterns. And so we often run like 6,000 simulations for the same operating year, and we have like 6,000 different combinations of these future uncertainties. In the past, until this year, we've been using historic natural river flow record from 1929 through 2008. We've used observed hourly temperatures from 1949 through 2017 as a source for us to forecast what future loads might be. In other words, we can get a repeat of those temperatures in the future. Not we can, but if we did. Generator forced outages are modeled as essentially just a standard Markov process, 2 stages where in our analysis, it's either on or off. We have mean time to repair and mean time between failures. This is a very common sort of approach. And for wind and solar, we use a combination of both historic and NREL data that's converted into hourly capacity factors, which then we multiply by the installed nameplate capacity to get hourly patterns of both wind and solar generation at 3 different sites in the Northwest, the Columbia River Gorge, Eastern Washington, and Montana. And for solar, we essentially just model, we use NREL data for Southern Idaho solar, and that's primarily because that's where most of the solar is that we have to date. So the council's adequacy standard, the metric that the council chose to use is a kind of an unusual one, but it's very simple. And it's an annual loss of load probability, which I'll define in just a minute. And they set the threshold at 5%. So let me move on and give you a little more detail about this, but did I hear a question? Or
yeah, I do. This is Fred. I have a question, 2 questions. First, if you could say, to your knowledge, I'm not sure, in the West or in the Northwest, is LOLE actually used by utilities and others, generally for planning? Because I have not run into it in the West.
Yes, but it's translated into different things. For example, I think PacifiCorp at one time, and I think, now I can't remember who else, were using the 2.4 hours per year. They were using the 1 day in 10 year LOLE and translating it into 2.4 hours per year. There are others like Puget Sound Energy who have adopted the 5% annual LOLP. Like the council uses. So it's kind of all over the map. In fact, if you look at the NERC, I should send you a link. NERC, every 2 years they publish a report on adequacy where they ask all of their subregions to report all of their, they say just please report what the numbers are. They don't set a threshold. They don't say whether you're adequate or not. But they also do a, I think there was also a survey done where they asked all of the utilities what they use for their own planning. And that's kind of interesting. I'll see if I can get that link to you, Fred, and you can distribute it.
Okay.
And you can see what all the utilities use in terms of their adequacy metrics.
And my second...
It's always helpful to know what the numerators and the denominators are. I mean, is a 5% threshold, you can't meet 5% of your load for 1 millisecond, or you can't meet 5% of your load for 2.4 hours, or you can't meet 5% of your load for the whole year?
You're jumping ahead a little bit, Jim. I'm getting there, but thanks for the question. It means you're paying attention. That's good.
And this is Fred. So my second question is just, I'm sure you'll address this, but why the council has chosen this rather than the LOLP method?
That's a good question because I think, I'm not sure exactly. This was done in 1999 and prior to the and I'm not going to forget your question, Jim. So hang on to it. If I don't get to it, make sure you ask it again. But I have slides that'll address your question. So during the 1990s, if many of you will recall, it was thought that the market would kind of take away all of our planning functions, and that if we had the right economic signals, that resources would get built and so forth and so on. But not much was built in the 90s in the Northwest, at least. And if you look at the Bonneville's White Book or the PNUCC NRF, which is the Northwest Regional Forecast of Loads and Resources, where they do a deterministic assessment of just a load resource balance, the load resource balance was becoming very negative. Now, you might say, well, wait a minute. If you have fewer resources than load, isn't that inadequate? Well, the way that they calculate the balance is that for hydro, they use the critical hydro generation, which is a 1 in 80 year event. The difference between critical hydro generation and average hydro generation is 4,000 megawatts. And so even if the load resource balance is negative, and it was starting to get negative in the mid to late 90s, you might still have an adequate supply because let's say you're 1,000 megawatts deficit. Well, shoot, you still have a pretty good chance of being okay because there's 4,000 megawatts more. If you were to get an average water year, you're in the clear. The problem was that load resource balance was getting close to minus 4,000 megawatts by the end of the 90s. And so Bonneville came to us, actually Judy Johansson, who was the administrator at the time, and she said, our load resource balance is getting really deficit, and we don't know if we have an adequate supply. So can we come up with a different way to measure it? And that's where we developed Genesis and came up with we said, let's just, I don't know who brought this up, but we said, let's just go with a very simple probabilistic metric. I'm going to define it now. And it's an annual loss of load probability. And what it basically is, and we'll get to it, is to answer Jim's question, it's simply the number of simulations that have at least one shortfall event divided by the total number of simulations that we run. And so we were not concerned about how many events per year. We're not concerned about how long they are or how big they are. We're simply saying how many in these simulations that we run, how many of them have at least one problem. And it's a very simple metric, and the council is working toward getting a more detailed adequacy standard, which will address magnitude and duration and frequency more directly, but we're not there yet. And the reason that we're not there yet is because our model was not accurate enough in terms of assessing capacity needs, and that's why we totally redeveloped our model. We went, and I can talk about that later. But the new model is more like Aurora. It's got the same kind of bubbles, balancing authorities, and all the transmission. It does a plant-specific hourly dispatch for hydro, and it dynamically assigns reserves. And so it's a much better model to assess capacity. Once we have that model running and vetted and accepted, then we can think about changing our adequacy standard to be more of a frequency, duration, and magnitude type of measure, which, by the way, I wrote a paper on and got published on why that is the most robust type of adequacy metric that you can have. So how do we assess adequacy? Well, on the left here, we see a map of resources in the Northwest minus the hydro. If I were to put hydro there, that would dominate. And so we've got coal, gas, wind, solar, etc. And the Genesis model, as I said before, is a chronological hourly simulation model that simulates the operation of Pacific Northwest resources for 1 year. And it does model also some exchanges with other regions, but in a simplified way. And we basically pull the slot, and for every simulation, we get different combinations of river flows, temperatures, and demand, solar, wind, forced outages. The model will record all hours when load cannot be served. And as I mentioned before, the annual loss of load probability is simply the number of simulations with shortfalls divided by the total number of simulations. Did I have a
shortfall of 1 kilowatt hour counts as a shortfall?
Absolutely.
Good.
Yep, absolutely. We hardly ever see that, but yes, it would.
So this is Fred, just to say, you know, I never really thought of it quite this way, but I'm really glad you explained this way, John. By the way, I'm a member of the Resource Adequacy Advisory Committee at the Council that John is kind of the manager of. And the loss of load probability isn't really a traditional metric. It doesn't measure anything directly. It's a measure of tail risk in the distribution, and it doesn't measure magnitude, duration, or frequency. So this is a really interesting perspective, I think, for looking at a system that's dominated by renewable or by variable resources, because the variations that happen from year to year, from time to time, are pretty considerable. And, you know, the real question is, what problem are we trying to solve?
Exactly. So to be very precise, the council deems the power supply to be adequate if the likelihood of having one or more shortfalls in a future year is less than or equal to 5%. In words, that's what it is. But as Fred just said, you can have 3 or 4 or 5 different power supplies that have exactly the same LOLP, and they could all be vastly different in terms of the size of the problems or the duration of the problems. And that's one of the problems with loss of load probability. And that's one of the reasons that I recommended that the council revisit the adequacy standard. It's in the action plan for the 7th plan. But as I said before, before we move to something like, well, ideally what we would do is measure the frequency, duration, and magnitude of potential problems, and then set some kind of threshold for all of those. But before you can do that, you have to have a model that accurately represents how the system is really run in the real world. And that's why we stopped, and we spent a lot of money to redevelop the model so that it's much more accurate. We think it's a much better model. And by the way, by problem events, I mean when I talk to people about adequacy, I say the way that I would approach it is, you tell me what an unwanted event is. You tell me what it looks like. It could be a shortfall that has a certain duration or a certain magnitude, and then you tell me how often you can tolerate it. Or it could be events where the prices spike above a certain level. Like, I don't want to see prices above $1,000 a megawatt hour for more than once every 5 years. Or it could be even something like you have operations on the hydro system to enhance the survival of fish and wildlife, which can be curtailed during times of emergencies. And you can say, hey, my adequacy standard is that I don't want to curtail those fish and wildlife operations more than once every 20 years. It can be a number of things. Once you establish those unwanted events, then you figure out what the tolerance is, and that's your standard. Anyway, that's there's a lot of work yet to be done. But I think the most robust type of adequacy standard you can have is to sort of identify those unwanted events. They can be money events or actual shortfall events. And then you say, how often are we willing to tolerate that? Again, the trade-off. You can reduce the average cost of the system, but then you increase the chance of a high cost year. Yes, question.
Yeah, I mean, it seems so vague to me when you talk about tolerance, how you establish a standard based on something that's so subjective.
It's hard to do, no question. One way that some people are doing it is with the value of lost load, where there have been estimates done. The implied value of lost load of our standard in the Northwest is roughly $25,000 a megawatt hour, meaning that if you assume that customers, if you could pay a customer $25,000 a megawatt hour, or if your replacement resource is $25,000 a megawatt hour, there would be a break-even point. I mean, there's a whole other presentation I could do on incorporating the value of lost load in defining your threshold. But that's difficult because, as I said before, people have different tolerances for curtailments. And I'm not talking about the distribution system or in your house. I'm talking about like major like disruptions, like half the city. Something like that. So it is subjective, no question about it. But the 1 in 10 year seems to be a very sort of commonly accepted thing. And I think what we're moving toward is like no more than one event in 10 years where the event can be some kind of a significant event. We're not talking about one kilowatt hour for 1 minute. We're talking about something significant. So you say, what if we lost, what's a significant event? Wow, we lose 200 megawatts in the city of Portland. Okay, well, that's a significant event. Well, we don't want more than one of those in every 10 years. If that's how you define it, then you can set up your standard based on that. So, and I think that people kind of have more of an intuitive approach about the events. Say, how often are you willing to tolerate a somewhat significant event, which might be you lose a big, let's say a sort of a blackout in a large section of your city or in your utility area. And so you're right, it's very subjective. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay, so this is, and this all just leads up to how we're going to use this standard to define the adequacy reserve margin, which in essence is like a planning reserve margin. And so, before we go there though, I should give you a status report on where we are. This is essentially this is the results that we got from the last official resource adequacy assessment that the council produced. And we do one of these once a year. Excuse me. And what we're seeing here is the operating year in the first column, and then the annual LOLP in the second column. And then I've got kind of a running incremental amount and cumulative amount of coal retirement as announced as of, I think, well, at least as of last November. And so as you can see, a lot of the numbers are in red, which are over 5%. So we are under 5% now, estimated. But by 2021, we're going to lose Boardman and Centralia, I think. I can't remember now. I've got the, if you want to see them, I can show you the retirement schedule. So we jumped from under 5% to about 7.5% by next year. It doesn't take much for us to get back down to 5%. To get from 7.5% down to 5% only requires about, I don't know, 300 megawatts of capacity. It's not very much. But you see the next big jump is 2024 when we lose another 530 megawatts of coal, and it jumps to 26% by 2026, and then by 2033 we go up to almost a 50-50 chance of having some kind of a problem, probably a large problem in the year. And of course, this is with nothing added and just with load growth.
And John, just to add, because you talked about that, this also this morning, was it's not just no additions, it's also no expansion on the transmission system.
That's true too. Absolutely. The transmission system is fixed. Correct. Absolutely. So just for perspective, in 1999, when we first did our assessment of the power supply, we did it for 3 years out, and we came up with a 24% loss of load probability. This was in 1999. We published a report. People looked at it and said, oh, this is a unique way of doing adequacy. Interesting. And then I don't think we were lucky, but in 2001, we had kind of a very dry year with maybe some manipulation of resources in California, and we didn't have a blackout, but we had a very high cost year. In that year, Bonneville spent nearly $1.5 billion, mostly to pay the aluminum companies to shut down. We lost, overall, we lost about 2,500 megawatts of load out of about a 25,000 megawatt load system. So we lost about 10% of load. Not all of it came back. The aluminum companies did not come back, or at least not most of them. And so even though we didn't have a forced outage, we lost load, and it was very expensive, and it went into rates, obviously. So if we don't do anything, shoot, by 2026, we're back to the same place.
Well, and this is right, just to note that there are, our utilities in the Northwest are doing things, but they're either in IRPs or they're actually out. PacifiCorp has a big RFP on the street. PGE will be doing so soon. $10 billion is going to get spent. It's not like we're not doing anything, but I think the key thing is we don't know exactly what those resources are yet.
Well, they do, PNUCC does list some of the planned resources. And if you, there's a footnote here, and Fred, I see you read that footnote. If you go to the individual IRP reports by utilities and you take their sort of planned resources, and of course there's different levels of planning. We only count resources in our assessment if they are cited and licensed and are expected to be operational. But there are lots of resources that are listed in their plans that are not cited or licensed, blah, blah, blah. But if you count all of those, generally there's sufficient resources to get us back into an adequate supply. But they're not very, they're not cited and licensed, and so we don't count them.
And so one final question for context: the 4,800 megawatts of coal retirement by 2033 is about what percentage of the total Northwest, as the council defines it, capacity? Peak. Maybe a better way of putting it is peak demand.
Oh, well, you can either look at it as from resource capacity or demand. Right now, our typical winter, we're winter peaking region right now, and I think our winter peak, average peak is 35,000 megawatts, but it can range up to as high as 45,000. In the summer, our peak load is around 29,000 megawatts. If you're comparing it to load. In terms of our, if you're talking about nameplate capacity, the Northwest has 65,000 megawatts of nameplate capacity, but half of that, more than half, is hydro. It's better to look at the sustained peaking capability of the hydro system, which is much lower. And so if you look at the sort of the sustainable capacity of the system, it's more like around 50,000 megawatts.
So that 4,800 is about 10% of that sustained regional
roughly.
Peaking capacity.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Correct. Okay. Excellent. Good to go. And Jim, did I answer your question about how we define that?
You answered my question about how we defined it, and I am aghast at the result.
So am I. Actually, I'm trying to move us away from that. So, but okay. Okay, but it's better than just a straight load resource balance accounting, because that doesn't, that's worse. Okay, now before I go on here, we, of course, for the 2021 power plan, we are moving in a totally different direction. Up through this year, we've been using historical based data to help project future loads and to help project future river flows, et cetera, et cetera. We decided that we were going to use, because it became available, the IPCC5 downscaled data for climate change from multiple global circulation models. It was downscaled by a group called the ARM, which is the River Management Joint Operating Committee. It's the 3 federal agencies plus University of Washington and Oregon State, and I think maybe another school. And what they did is they took the very gross results from the IPCC studies, and there were like 19 or 20 different GCMs that were used. And they took some of those and they downscaled them, meaning that they narrowed it down specifically for the Northwest. And they ended up with 19 different scenarios. And of those 19, we chose 3 of them to be representative for the Northwest. And those 3 captured the full range of possibilities from the lowest to the highest in both winter and summer. And by that, I mean that in every single case for climate change, with increasing temperatures, it's very intuitive. With increasing temperatures, you would, even if the precipitation is exactly the same year after year, you would expect that during the fall and winter, you would get more rain and less snow with higher temperatures. And so you would expect on average that the river flows would be higher in the fall and winter. Because then you have less snow and less of a snowpack, you would have lower flows in the spring and summer. It's not always the case. These downscale data provide a wide variation, and that's another presentation I could make, a very wide variation of possibilities. And it's not like we don't see cold snaps in the future with climate change data. We do. In fact, there's a couple of cases where the temperatures that are projected under climate change for the winter are colder than what we've seen in history since all the way back through 1949. Although on average, they tend to be higher. So using the downscaled climate change data, which is a fundamental difference in approach, because in the past, as I said, we've used historical river flows, assuming that they might happen again in the future. We've used historical observed temperatures, assuming they would repeat in the future. Now we're using projected river flows and projected temperatures based on the downscaled GCM data. And so the next slide is going to show you a multitude of numbers. So let me step through it very slowly here.
John, let me interrupt for just one moment and
Sure.
just to acknowledge and congratulate, thank the council, John, and the council for a really, really deep effort to make the climate adjusted baseline happen. This is certainly I know no other planning effort that's doing this, maybe not in the world. And this is really, really important, obviously, going forward, but it's not straightforward. You don't just pick a bunch of data off the shelf. There's a lot of work that has to go through to assess that data. We're not relying as much on historical data, although one of the findings you might want to talk about this, John, is there's a climate signal already in the data that we've got. But there was a lot of work that had to go into it, making sure that this is the right way to go and that the data is capable of supporting the full analysis the council is doing. So I just wanted to say that because it's, like I say, not just a hand wave. There was at least a year of effort that went into getting us to where we are.
Thanks, Fred. Appreciate that. And what Fred alluded to was that because if you believe in climate change and if you believe that it's been happening, although in non-linear fashion, because we're using such a long historical record of river flows and temperatures, we're actually dampening the effects of climate change in our results. So that last line here that says the 2024 RA, the 12.8%, it's this line 2024, 12.8. It's the same line as the bottom line here. Ignore the stuff on the right for now. Just look at the LOLP. So that 12.8 is probably lower than it should be because we're using data from the 1920s and temperature data is from the 1940s, which didn't have the same climate effects as the temperatures in the 2015, 16, and 17. In fact, I went back and did a study where I only used the last 30 years of data and the numbers changed. And you can see the pattern, you can see the trends going forward. So we've done ourselves a bit of a disservice by using these long historical records. And when I do the climate change data, people say, well, look at that. We use 3 climate change scenarios, and then we use an average. And so that green line would be what we would think the loss of load probability would be for 2024 using climate change data compared to the 17% compared to the 13% using historical data. However, as I said, people look at that and say, wow, that's a big jump. Is there some kind of a discontinuity there? And I say, no. If we were to go back and reassess the 2024 resource adequacy assessment using more current data, that 12.8 wouldn't be 12.8. It would probably be a little bit higher, closer to 17. And so we're doing ourselves a disservice by using these long historical records. They're dampening the effects of climate change. And then when you show the results, people say, wow, that's a huge difference. There must be some kind of a disconnect in the data. Whereas in fact, there isn't. And then, as I said to Fred, I'd be happy to come back and talk to you about our selection of climate change data and the concerns that people have had, and how we don't see a disconnect from historical data to climate change data, and how the variability of the climate change data is just as wide as the variability of the historical data that we have. Fred has seen all of that, and we've taken good care to try to make sure that the data is robust. And so comparing 12.8 to 17.0 is almost apples to oranges, because the 12.8 incorporates a very long record of data, a lot of which, and so we're basically taking the effects of climate change and just basically dampening them down when we do that. Fred, you were going to say something? No?
No, I presume you're going to talk about the rest of the slide, but one thing I want to point out is that the relationship between the climate adjusted average and the traditional LOLP, it's pretty significantly higher for LOLP, and yet, you know, the different metrics actually have they look somewhat better actually for some of the other metrics.
Right. Let me just do a quick check on time here. Are we doing okay still?
Yeah, I think we're fine. Another half hour is fine.
Okay,
You might have to speed up a little bit.
I'm going a little bit slower, but I'm happy to take questions along the way. So what I've done here, well, first of all, I wanted to show you that individually, each of the three climate change scenarios cover quite a wide range. The case G is a fairly mild climate change, where case A is more severe and 14 is more in the middle. And as I said, we chose these three because they cover the full range of possibilities. And because we don't know which one will happen, we wanted to make sure that we cover the full range, and then we just simply take a straight average to get the 17. Now, the columns under EUE, LOLH, and LOLEV are the three metrics that NERC would like us to report. And as Fred alluded to, if you look at, let's look at EUE. Under climate change, the shortfalls you'll see in the next slide, we're moving from a mostly winter needy region with some summer problems to almost entirely a summer needy region. And again, that's because in the fall, we expect river flows to be higher, meaning more hydroelectric generation. At the same time, temperatures are higher and the loads are going to be lower, so that improves the situation. And in the summer, we anticipate lower river flows, translating into lower hydro generation on average. With higher temperatures, we see more air conditioning load and loads overall. So it makes it better for the winter, worse in the summer, and we see that. I'll show that in the next slide. But an interesting thing is that the magnitude of the problems, which is under EUE, is much smaller with climate change when you use the climate change data, and the duration is shorter. That's under the LOLH. However, they happen more frequently. You'll see that the loss of load events is quite a bit higher. That's LOLEV is 0.39 instead of 0.26. But the important message, the LOLP is not, it's a little bit higher overall, but it's roughly in the same range. But what's really of interest is the shift. This chart shows the loss of load probability by month for the 2024 operating year based on historical data on the left, with an annual LOLP of 12.8%. And then the same thing for 2024 on the right, but with climate change data. And the LOLP goes up a little bit, but the most important thing, I think, is that you see this shift from being kind of a split winter, summer, needy region into basically all the problems ending up in summer. And I think this is one of the messages that is important, because the choice of resource, this may make a big difference in the choice of resource that we make as we plan for long-term resource expansion.
John?
So yes, please.
Carl Zakel here. Just a quick question. the cost of reducing or getting access to more capacity when you're going to be needing it. I'm just curious if regional grid integration has been factored into any of the scenarios, like looking more broadly for resources. This is important because capacity will not be built in some of the areas that could have great summer generating potential if there's not an ability to get that into a broader market. In California, for example,
Yep.
every megawatt that we produce of solar has a decreasing capacity value.
Oh, yeah.
And if we have an opportunity to stimulate investment in places that have great resources that could match another region's needs, those resources may not be built if we don't have a better handle on how to integrate our resources better across the grid. So I'm just wondering if you're considering any of that at all as a way of mitigating some of these challenges.
Oh, absolutely. Not in these studies. In these studies, we assume essentially the Northwest is a copper plate, except, well, two copper plates, one on the east, one on the west. And we limit the amount of imports from California to 2,500 megawatts during the winter, some during the summer, but only during the off-peak hours. And so we do not take that into consideration with this classic Genesis run. But with our redeveloped model, which is more like Aurora, we recognize the transmission between the balancing areas, and we do allow for those economic transfers and sharing of resources. And so we understand that that could be a solution. And so that's another reason why we wanted to build the new model with more detail in it. And so that is a very, very good point. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's move on to the two metrics that I talked about before. The adequacy reserve margin is basically like a planning reserve margin. It's essentially the amount of surplus capacity or energy that you need above your expected load in order to ensure adequacy. And the associated system capacity contribution is like the ELCC. It's basically the net firm capacity that you gain when you add a resource or a combination of resources to a power supply. The difference between an adequacy reserve margin and a planning reserve margin is that a lot of people use a building block approach to build the planning reserve margin. For example, they might take their peak demand, their expected peak demand, and add 5% for generator outages, maybe 9% for contingency and balancing reserves, and 4% for extreme weather events, and bingo, there's your planning reserve margin, 18%. I know the power pool does that. A lot of people used to do that. A lot of people don't do that anymore. Now we use, the ARM is based on probabilistic methods, and I can skip a couple of these. Basically, to calculate the ARM, what we do is we design a power supply that exactly meets the adequacy standard. And then from that power supply, we extract the resource capacity and the expected load and see what that number is, and that becomes our target for the adequacy reserve margin. And that gets fed into our system expansion planning model, regional portfolio model. And so in that model, basically it will build resources for two reasons. If the resource is economic, or if it needs a resource to meet the ARM threshold. So in a nutshell, that's how we do it. So how do we calculate the adequacy reserve margins? Well, as I said before, we do one for energy and for capacity, but basically it's simply we design a system that, and we do it by quarters. We design a system that exactly meets the quarterly LOLP target. And then we just take the peaking capacity from that system minus the peak load and divide by the peak load, and that's the ARM. How do we assign quarterly LOLP targets? They change as you go through time. Let me go to the next chart because this is more telling. Here we have a monthly distribution of loss of load probability for 2023. As you can see, most of the problems occur in winter, with a few in the summer. As we go through time and we lose more resource, the scale is different on these, by the way, if you notice. So we're getting more problems because we're not adding resources, we're taking them away. In 2027, we've lost 3,000 megawatts of coal. And so we're getting more winter problems and more summer problems. Then by 2031, they're all in summer. So if we look at these, in 2023, about 80% of the problems are in winter. In 2027, we have a split 40% in fall and winter, and then about 20%, or excuse me, 40% in January through March, 40% in summer, and about 20% in the fall. And then by 2031, all the problems are in the summer. The council does not have a quarterly adequacy standard. They have an annual standard. And so this is something that we had to do. We had to assign these quarterly targets in order for us to get quarterly adequacy reserve margins. In the future, the council may have quarterly targets, we hope. Anyway, so this is how we did this. How do we calculate it? Well, this is just an example of, for 2027, how we calculate the ARM. Here we've created we've run a power supply for 2027 with all of the retirements and so forth and load growth. And we take the existing thermal, which is the nameplate times 1 minus the forced outage. We take the existing wind, we calculate what the expected generation is over the 2-hour peak load. We figure out when the 2-hour peak load happens. Same thing for solar. For battery, for firm contracts, we just take the net peak hour. And for hydro, we don't have critical hydro because this is climate change hydro. And so we basically take out of the 30 years of hydro that we have for this decade, we take the lowest one. And so it's kind of like a critical period hydro. And then there's one line here that says capacity that we need for adequacy. This is the amount of capacity that we have to add in that 1 quarter in order for us to get to that target, which in this case is 2%, which is in the red square up above. So we just take the total resource, subtract the load, and then divide by the load, and we get 38.8%. That seems rather high, but this is a very specific kind of metric that's used just for our models. And so it's really not comparable to something like a planning reserve margin. We would not suggest that a utility go out and plan to a 38% planning reserve margin because it's a totally different idea. But in our system, if we plan a system that has a 38.3% surplus in quarter 1, if we go back and rerun it through our models, we should get a 2% loss of load probability in that quarter. That's how that works. So this table just very quickly shows you what these really, they don't mean much, except that these are the adequacy reserve margins that we're using in our system planning program, the regional portfolio model. And I don't want to dwell on this. I'm just saying this is how we calculate them. They are not to be, some of them look like planning reserve margins. They're in the same magnitude, but they're totally different animal. That's why we called it something different. We called it the adequacy reserve margin, not the planning reserve margin.
So John, Jim asked a question I think is worth talking about for just a moment, which is, and this is a long-running discussion in the RAC, is how do we account for imports?
Well, we only count, if they are firm contractual imports, then they become part of the load. In terms of spot market availability or purchase ahead, we limit that right now. The RAC decided to limit that to a fixed amount. So right now, the spot market availability for the winter is set to 2,500 megawatts in any hour. And in the summer, we allow no spot market, but we do also allow for what we call purchase ahead, which is only available. These are imports that are only available during the off-peak hours, which would be like from, I think, 10 o'clock until 6 in the morning, or something like that. And they only happen not during an hour of need, but they only happen if the model anticipates there might be a shortfall either in the next day or the next week. And so the model would import power during the night and use that to replace hydro generation and keep the water behind the reservoirs, so that we would have additional peaking capability during the peak hours of the next day. And so that's what we assume. It's a very simplistic approach. That's what the RAC wanted. We've been doing that for years and years. The new model is a little bit more sophisticated and a little bit more dynamic in that we do model the resources and loads outside of the region. And it's a more, I would say, a realistic assessment of what's available, even though the RAC says, well, even though it's more realistic, we still want a knob to control that. So,
right. So
it seems to me that there's a there's a pretty interesting dynamic going on, shown here in 2031-2041 period, with the criteria for the Northwest moving from winter to summer at about the same time that electrification expectations in California are anticipated to move their peak system demand from summer to winter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is anybody considering the changes in both regions?
We are. Yeah, we are. We're doing, as we do these studies in Aurora, we're also doing an electrification study with Aurora, where we're anticipating the loads are going to go up based on that electrification. And we're also doing some studies in the Northwest where we're doing the same thing for the Northwest. And so we are looking at those as sensitivity studies right now.
So just one more point back to the imports, and I'm going to oversimplify this, but consider that we have about 8,000 megawatts of transfer capacity between California and the Northwest. Actually, the DC intertie going north is currently limited to 1,000 megawatts. You know, you could possibly raise that. But the bigger issue is that, and the AC intertie is about 4,800 both directions at peak, but that's not always the case, and there are maintenance windows and other kinds of things you have to consider. So the 2,500 megawatts that John mentioned, the long-running discussion in our committee about this, with a lot of discussion with Bonneville about the transmission side. First of all, you have to consider the possibility that DC intertie just isn't available. We've had 4 instances of that in the last month for brief outages. So on peak, you know, that's an N-1 contingency. We really can't count the, you know, some portion of the intertie capacity being available, you know, when we actually really need it. So the question has been, do you want to raise from 2,500 to say 3,400 megawatts or in thereabouts? And that discussion is still going on. There's plenty of resource generally in California in the winter to meet peak in the Northwest in the winter, but the transmission constraint is pretty important.
That's true. And so, and this has become one of the major topics for the power plan, because obviously there's a trade-off. The more you rely on the market supply, the lower your average system cost, but then the higher the likelihood of a very high cost year. And so, you know, it's a, you have to.
The high cost years, John, at least for the investor-owned utilities, which have power cost adjustment mechanisms, quickly translate into higher costs for consumers. And if we can synchronize those events, then we can get some price elasticity during the high cost years. And right now, those power cost adjustment mechanisms mostly have a lag to the next year. So we get the price suppression at a time we don't need it instead of at a time when it would be valuable. Is there any thought of looking at how to synchronize those?
I'm not, but I have heard at least one discussion about that within our staff this year, but I'm not involved with that. But you're absolutely right. Look at what happened in 2001. We didn't really see the consumers didn't see that until a year or two later, right?
Well, some places they saw it right away, and some places they never saw it at all.
Well, that's true. Yeah, that's true.
I mean, Georgia Pacific saw it right away and shut down their Bellingham.
Yeah.
And so we know that price suppression can work.
Yeah.
And if it's synchronized, it can work to our benefit. If it's unsynchronized, it can be of no use at all.
I think having correct price signals and having them as soon as possible, and having and being transparent to know what everybody has is very important, and it can be a cheaper solution than everybody kind of just doing their own thing. That's for sure, and that's kind of what we're pushing for too. But anyway, easier said than done, right, Jim?
Indeed.
All right, let me get to the ASCC, because I think this is something new that nobody else that I know of is doing. E3 is doing a little bit of this, but not really much. What is the ASCC? Well, basically, it's like the ELCC. It's essentially the amount of capacity that the system capacity that you gain when you add a resource to an existing system. The way that we calculate it, we called it a different name because ELCC is calculated, and usually it's calculated in a different way. But I won't go into that. We don't have time. The way we calculate ASCC is that we start with a system that has some curtailment, so we can build a peak hour curtailment duration curve, which I'm going to explain in a minute. and then we add a resource and it drops that curve. And so we take the reduction in peak curtailment and divide it by the incremental capacity needed, and that's the ASCC. I've got an example here. So this is a peak hour duration curve for a base case. On the vertical scale, you've got well, what we do to create this is we run, I've told you that the model is a Monte Carlo model. We run thousands of simulations. So from each of the simulations, we pull out of each simulation the highest curtailment hour. So if we run 6,000 games, we have 6,000 numbers. And then we rank them from highest to lowest, and then we plot them, and that's what this is. And you'll notice that it crosses at 9. Well, let me go back. It crosses at 9 because that means that 9% of the simulations had at least some level of curtailment. The LOLP then is 9% here. It's easy to read it off the scale. But we had one case way up. I didn't even graph it. We had at least one case that had more than 1,500 megawatt, 1 hour with more than 1,500 megawatts of curtailment. But anyway, so this is a curtailment duration curve. Now, to calculate the ASCC, let's take wind. I add 400 megawatts of nameplate wind, and as expected, the duration curve drops. It's not always parallel. This is an illustrative example, but it drops 100 megawatts. So the ASCC in this case is 100 divided by 400. What that means is 25%. What that means is that if you had 400 megawatts of wind, you gain roughly 100 megawatts of capacity. That's not outlandish. If you need 25 megawatts of firm capacity in your system, and the ELCC for wind is 25%, you have to build 400 megawatts of wind, right? But let's take combustion turbines now. Same base case, we had a combustion turbine. In this case, the peak hour curtailment drops by 500 megawatts, making the ASCC 125%. I made this presentation to an IEEE committee back east, and their jaws were on the floor. They said, wait a minute, whoa. How can you be over 100%? That's impossible. And I said, well, remember, we have a huge hydro system in the Northwest, and what can happen, assuming that prices are allow it, and assuming that the hydro system has the flexibility, if you have a combustion turbine and if it's committed and if you can run it at night, you can run it at night and save water, and then the next day, not only do you get the full capacity of the combustion turbine, you get that extra peaking capability from the hydro system. And so the net effect is you get more than the nameplate capacity as a net available capacity. Or anyway,
so you get the same effect, John, if you drop a load at the customer meter, because you're avoiding marginal line losses and marginal reserve requirements. You get about a 500 megawatt system benefit from a 400 megawatt load reduction.
Jim, the ASCCs for energy efficiency are about the same level or higher. You'll see it.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Exactly right. Exactly right. Okay. So now here's the problem. And I want to focus on this. I just have a few more slides, and then I'm sorry it took so long, but I think it's important to go in detail, right, Fred?
Yes.
You'll probably never ask me back
This
again.
is the punchline we're coming up to here.
All right. So the problem with single resource ASCC is that, it tends to decline as more resources added. Same thing with ELCC. You add more wind, it goes down. You add more solar, and it goes down. And so what the solution is, you can figure that out. You can create an S that's a function of installed capacity, but there's another problem. What if you add a competing resource? And by competing, I mean a resource that competes with other resources like the hydro storage. Same thing happens. If you had 100 megawatts of wind, and then you add another 100 megawatts of wind, ACC goes down. You add 100 megawatts of wind and 100 megawatts of solar, same thing happens. What's the solution? Well, how about if you take the average? Well, that would work, except that in studies that we've done, we've recognized that the composite ASCC of those combo resources is not the average. So the solution is to calculate an ASCC table for all combinations of all available resources, and this is where it gets really interesting. So unfortunately, it requires a lot of work, but these are the 7 sort of generic types of resources that we are going to use to calculate our ASCC table or ASCC array. We've got thermal, solar, a couple of wind, energy efficiency, and then a short and long-term energy limited resources. And so we basically have 7 resources, and we want to capture kind of a wide enough range. So we put in a low level of installed and a high level of installation. Bottom line is
where's
that
the demand response, John?
Demand response is under the short-term energy limited. and we put it, we classify it as the same level as the battery, only because you'll see in a minute why. So we have 7 resources and 2 level of installed capacity. If you look at every combination of that, that's 2 to the 7, that's 128 studies. If you wanted to do 3 levels of installation, it's 3 to the 7, that's like 2,100 some studies that I have to run. But it gets complicated because we have 3 climate change scenarios. And so in order for me to create this 128 rows of ASC array, I have to run 384 Genesis studies. And I've done that. And you can think of it as every combination of these 7 resources and 2 levels of installed capacity, 128 actual numbers, and actually here it is. Actually, this is the first 18 rows of the ASC table. So on the left, you see the 7 resources that we have, and the middle column shows the total added resource, and then on the right, you see the quarterly ASCC values. I'm going to give you an example, so you don't have to, I mean, you can look at this if you want. I can give you the whole table if you want. You can think of this as a 7-dimensional surface that can be plotted in an 8-dimensional graph, where on each axis you've got the amount of resource. And let's say that you're doing some planning and you say, well, here's the combination, here's the resource portfolio that I want. You can go to that surface and do a linear interpolation between the 2 nearest points and get the capacity value of that portfolio. But I have an example. Let's do it.
John, before you go on, this was the point at which my eyes really got pretty wide, because what this does is it moves us beyond looking at onesie, twosie, put in a resource, run the ELCC, or, and compare that to the other resource. Now we have all the new resources compared to, as a portfolio, which is really what we want. And this is not an exhaustive examination of every possible combination, 1 megawatt at a time. This is a sparse matrix. The idea is to find the hot spots, the good spots in the distributions that are worth looking at. And also, as John will describe, to provide input into the actual full planning model.
Let me do an example. I think that's the best way to do it. So let's say that I have a proposed portfolio that is, and very simple, just 2 resources. I want 700 megawatts of energy efficiency, measured as energy in this case, and 2,500 megawatts of solar. That's the yellow line, first row there. So I want to find out what the net capacity gain is for, let's say, for the summer for that particular portfolio. Well, I picked the 2 nearest points in the table. The first point has only 700 megawatts of EE. The next point has 700 megawatts of EE and 5,000 megawatts of solar. I picked them because they're easy. The portfolio that I want happens to be right between them. And so what I do is for Q3, which is summer, the ASCC is 1.03 for the only for the EE. It's 0.52 for the combination of 700 megawatts of EE and 5,000 megawatts of solar. And so in this simple example, the ASCC for the third quarter for my portfolio is right between them, or 0.78. That translates into 2,480 megawatts of net capacity gained. What if I were to use the single resource ASCC values? And these were calculated separately, individually for resources. The third quarter ASCC for EE was 1.08. The third quarter ASCC for solar was 0.54. If I do the, here's the obvious problem. If you use single resource ASCC values, it underestimates the net summer capacity gained by almost 400 megawatts. And this is important because using single resource ASCC values, we can either overbuild or underbuild. And if we do that, if we build a resource strategy that is surplus or inadequate, that means we have to go back and iterate and tune up and do that over and over again until we get to what we want. And this is what happened in the 7th plan. We had to do this. And so this is why we are doing this. We don't want to get it perfect, but we want to get it close. The idea is that the regional portfolio model, and I think I have an example here. So The regional portfolio model looks at many load paths from 2022 to 2041. And for each load path, it faces different combinations of future unknowns. And as I said before, resources are acquired either because they're economic or because they have to meet the ARM requirement. And what the RPM does is it says, well, here, let me try. I know I need X amount of capacity to meet the ARM requirement, and I'm going to pick this combination of resources. Well, is that going to be sufficient? Well, it goes to the ASCC table, and it picks up it does a multidimensional linear interpolation to pick up what the capacity value is, and then it will add sufficient resources to meet the ARM requirement. When this is all done, we take sample resource buildouts from our expansion model and we run them back through the adequacy model to make sure that they're not overbuilt, meaning that the LOLP is 0, and that they're not underbuilt, meaning that the LOLP is over 5%. And so this is the general pattern, and this whole concept of the ASCC array or ASCC table, as far as I know, nobody else in the world is doing this. E3 is doing a little bit of this and doing, I think, what they call portfolio ELCC or something. Fred probably knows more about it than I do, but that's the only other thing, the only other group that I know that's even working on something like this. Of course, one of the benefits of us doing this in the blue here is that this table is available to utilities in the region, with the caveat that, of course, these are calculated based on regional resources and regional loads. And so these ASCC numbers may not be appropriate to individual utilities, but at least it gives them some idea of kind of the relative capacity contributions. And then they should build their own ASCC tables if they can for their IRP processes. And I'm sorry to kind of run through the last few slides, but this was kind of the, this is in a sense how we, first of all, the council has established a standard. It adopted it in 2011. It's not the best standard in the world. I'm working to get them to move to a better standard that requires a model that's more accurate and precise, and we're doing that. But then we take that standard and then we implement that into our resource expansion model by creating an adequacy reserve margin. And then we use the ask as a means of better getting us to the right answer faster instead of us having to iterate. And so in a nutshell, that's kind of what we do. And I hope that, hope we have a little bit of time left for questions.
Yeah, we definitely do. Just thanks for all of that. And just to point out, and I'll send around your slides from this morning, because there was a good example in there of what the consequences are of using the current approach, even for the ASCC, versus using this new method in reducing the risk of overbuilding or underbuilding. It's a very important finding already in this kind of work in progress that you're doing. So I know Tanya has a question and maybe others, so let's go for it. We have until 1 o'clock, so please go ahead. Tanya, are you on?
Hey, sorry,
There we are.
I am in and out of, there's a lot going on here, so I'm not getting everything. So apologies, John F., if you already addressed this. But for this, the System Advisory Committee, System Adequacy Advisory Committee, John Allis sent out an email the other day talking about, something, it brought up for me some of the complications with, here I am with a solar organization where half of our projects might be, or even a third or fewer, are system level resources, which would show up in your generation capacity, but a really large chunk are showing up as a reduction in load.
Yes.
And it's going to make load even weirder as you start adding building automation, demand response, autonomous curtailment, batteries. And then there are the QFs, and I'm still, I've been doing this now since March, and I'm still not 100% how the QFs are always fitting into this. I know when I was at PGE, we looked at them as load. I mean, they were essentially a reduction in overall load. But I know that some of these QFs are on PPAs, which may, they may be counting as a bilateral contract. So it's very confusing for me sometimes about how the huge changes in technology behind the meter, and let's call behind the meter everything from the feeder head down in the distribution system, you know, stuff that's happening at that transmission distribution interface. It's really making loads a lot weirder to predict. And maybe you could address how that ASC and the ARM interact with the weirdness of what's happening to loads.
Well, one thing that we don't have on here, and we probably should have, is is an ASC value for behind the meter stuff, and we can certainly have that. We used to do demand response as a load reduction, but now we're modeling it as a resource. But there is no reason that we can't have behind the meter resource here as one of these resources, and then do an ASC for that. And but now you have to be able to characterize what it looks like. And so that might be difficult, but you know, you have to tell us sort of what it looks like and when it would be implemented. You have to give us the pattern, but if we do that, we can calculate and ask for that. We have not done that, okay? But we can. For QFs, they would probably appear, my guess is that, well, we either have them on the resource side or else they're incorporated into our load forecast, one or the other, depending on where they are.
John, it seems to me like you're going to have behind the meter resources that are going to avoid transmission and distribution losses.
Yes.
You're going to have things like batteries at substations that will avoid transmission but not distribution losses. And when you're just showing 700 megawatts, I can't tell whether that's 700 megawatts at the meter, 700 megawatts at the substation, or 700 megawatts at the generation level. There's a big difference, because as I indicated in our paper on marginal line loss, my paper on marginal line losses shows it could be 25% at critical hours.
REE is all at the consumer site, so no transmission.
Right. So then if 700 megawatts at the site is worth about 1,000 megawatts at the
Absolutely. Yeah, and we do give it a credit in our planning model, not in this model, but yeah.
For marginal losses or for average losses?
For the cost of the resource in terms of when it's competing against other resources, it will show a lower cost because of that, and so it will get picked sooner. And I think that's the only way we're doing it right now.
Yeah, Jim, to answer your question, I don't think so, and that's something we should be thinking about.
Okay.
Yeah, so we're just doing it in a very simple way right now, not capturing the full effect. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, average rather than marginal losses.
And Tanya, I hope I answered your question. We are not doing the behind the meter stuff right now. If anything that's behind the meter now is coming in a load forecast, but we're not doing a sensitivity on it. We're not doing an ASCC. Yeah.
But it's a concern that I have, not just because OC is hiring, maybe because of, you know, what I've been seeing. Just this is going to get something that's going to get very volatile. Obviously, more intermittency at the generation side, but loads are also going to become far more volatile in real time. So I would love to, and I've talked to you and John Allis before. I think probably once the plan is out, it would be great to talk about building more models or bins for the ASC and seeing whether they differ substantially. I know John O has his thoughts on how to make a proxy for that, but you know, as we look at those emerging technologies, helping the industry understand how to get you the most current data on operational projects that simulate some of that, I think will be very beneficial for all of us. I do have to run. You did great. Thank you so much. Really helpful.
Thanks, Tanya.
Bye-bye.
Another thing is that there might be some transmission solutions as opposed to generation solutions, and the current Genesis model doesn't do that because it doesn't have it's not granular enough, but the new one does. The new one is much more granular in terms of we model the balancing areas with all the connecting transmission, more or less like the Aurora model, and so we might be able to do things like wow, if we build a transmission line here, that might be actually better than trying to just build generation in both places.
So I think we've got to the end of our time. Thank you very much, John, for this great presentation. I think the value for me is that this work is really finally getting at the core of the issue we're dealing with in a changing system, which is to capture and to implement the full value of diversity. And this kind of modeling is really important to do that. I'll send your slides from this morning around, and John's available for questions if you want to contact him directly, I presume. So
let me just emphasize that all of these numbers that you see here today were based on climate change based data. Okay. Yeah.
Right.
Now we're going to do it again with a new model, which will refine these further, which has the more granularity in it. So.
Thanks so much, John.
You bet. Yeah, no, thanks for having me. Be happy to come back to talk about climate change or anything else we do.
All right, we'll have you back at some point. All right, thanks everybody. We'll see you in 2 weeks.